بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد النبي المبعوث رحمة ونورا وهدى للعالمين، وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. الحمد لله. This is the first of our lessons on the fiqh of financial transactions from the Mukhtasar of Quduri. And financial transactions are one of the most important and frankly one of the most neglected aspects of the study of religion. Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, the great student of Imam Abu Hanifa, was known for his righteousness and his virtue, and he lived in much of his life in the second Islamic century, and with the spread of the Khilafah of the Muslims across the lands, land after land welcomed the Muslims there, and it's an amazing history. But there was great wealth, so a lot of scholars became worried about increase in worldliness as a result. So many a scholar in his time wrote works on zuhud, on renouncing worldliness. Amongst them Abdullah ibn Mubarak and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and many others. Even Abi Shayba and Waqi', many people wrote works on zuhud, on renunciation. These are early works on Islamic spirituality. However, Imam Muhammad Hassan didn't do so, even though he too was, had great interest in riwayah, in the science of transmission, though his focus was fiqh. And he was asked about that. لِمَ لَمْ تُؤَلِّفْ كِتَابًا فِي الزُّهْدِ? Why haven't you authored a work in renunciation? And he said, أَلَّفْتُ كُتُبًا فِي الْمُعَامَلَاتِ. I have authored many books in financial transactions, because the reality of one's renouncing worldliness is not manifest when you're sitting alone in your room, there's nothing there, and you say, I don't need anything. Well, because there's nothing that you could be seeking at that time, right? You're in a retreat in the forest, and you say, I don't need this world. Yeah, because you're fed and taken care of, and there's no worries. The renouncing worldliness is manifest عند البيع والشراء, when you're buying and selling. And this is a real test of taqwa, because human beings are needy, and this need has implications. That the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us and the abilities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted the human being, we have intellects. We are able to do more than merely survive. But to do more than merely survive, we need society. The human being, like other animals, we are social animals. We cannot optimally function alone, collectively at least. Right? We need one another, and if people deal with one another, then there is a potential of our fulfilling greater personal interest, and also protecting ourselves from greater degrees of harm. So human beings being needy, but having capacity, having istita'a, having the capacity to reason and to strive for their benefits, it would be entailed by that people would come together. But when you come together, there has to be a give and take. that give and take between people is one material and the other non-material. The non-material give and take or relating, right, is dealt with through akhlaq and adab, through character and proper manners. Right? There's a certain baseline you need to uphold, because otherwise, people just retreat into their caves. Okay? If every time someone you sees you, they knock you down and rip your clothes off and put them on because they like them, why don't you be like, maybe I shouldn't go around those people. Right? So that the non-material relations are dealt with akhlaq and adab, ethics, right? Character, propriety. But human beings, when they come together and they work, each person has things that the other wants. This requires material transactions and a way of regulating those material transactions. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us criteria on how to deal with those material transactions between ourselves. This is entailed by reason, that reasonable people, unswayed by their desires and whim, their animal tendencies, would concur that this is how we should deal with each other. It is summarized in one verse of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. This is from Surah An-Nisa, the 4th surah, verse 29. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. O you who believe, لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not consume wealth amongst each other or between each other in wrongful ways. إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. Except that it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement. Except that it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement. So, with people coming together, there has to be a way of deciding who owns what and what belongs to whom. And in humanity, throughout history, sometimes we imagine that history only began somewhere in the last 200-300 years in Europe. No. Throughout history, there have been different tendencies between those who sort of said, well, it's like a jungle, everyone fend for themselves, or at least some class in society can do whatever they want. And there's always been a spectrum between individualism and collectivism. And historically, this had many forms, right? In our times, you have sort of complete free market capitalism on the one side, and then socialism on the other, like socialism or communism. But these are relatively modern constructs, but the idea of collective ownership versus individual ownership and value systems, social and political, arise from how the economy is structured. And the economy is structured according to the values of people. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us some guiding principles regarding that, right? And this is not a class in understanding Islamic economics, but some background is important to appreciate. One of the underlying principles is that Islam recognizes individual ownership. Right? Islam recognizes and holds inviolable generally inviolable personal ownership. But it defines what is rightful ownership. What is rightful ownership? In terms of how wealth is acquired and how wealth is retained. But it also establishes social responsibilities. Right? Social responsibilities, economic and other. And these social responsibilities are individual responsibilities. You're responsible for your zakat, you're responsible for charity, you're responsible for nafaqah, for providing for your immediate family. And then there are collective social responsibilities. These are the furudul kifaya, that collectively we are obligated to take care of the poor, the needy, the oppressed, etc. And there's encouragement to establish institutions to take care of that at the collective level. Right? So it is not a recognition of individual ownership and property that calls us to individualism. But it recognizes the right of the individual, but also it recognizes societal responsibility. So, and the government, or the ruler, or we can simplify and use the term government, has a responsibility, which is safeguarding the public interest. But in general, that safeguarding of the public interest is not to intrude on the individual ownership or the individual rights of people. Okay? So why is this important? Because trade begins with the chapter on sales, buyur. And sales arise from a couple of things. The sales transaction requires ownership of something that is transacted over. There's transacting parties. There's a way that the transaction takes place. And there's qualities related to that transaction. So this is just a little bit of background to open the discussion. The governing verse that we refer to, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, O you believe, لَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ. O you believe, do not consume one another's wealth, right? One another's property in false ways. So this firstly affirms that people have ownership over things. So what is ownership? What does it mean to own something? Okay? And of course we're talking here of legal worldly ownership, right? Not to confuse it with, at the metaphysical level, we are all Allah's, etc. But in the relative sense of what that fiqh talks about in this world. The idea of milk, of ownership, is if you have complete ownership of something, called al-milk al-tam, الملك التام من شأنه أن يتصرف فيه المالك تصرفا مطلقا فيما يملكه. The ownership over something entails that you have a right of disposal over what you own. Okay? Or of a right of doing what you want with what you own. Okay? Whether in consuming it or benefiting from it or using it. Right? So that's a definition of milk, of ownership. It's a right of complete disposal over something. This is mentioned by Quduri Basha in Murshid al-Hayran, item Madda number 11. So that's لا تأكلوا أموالكم, do not consume one another's wealth. Right? So people have a right of transaction over what they own. Do not consume one another's wealth in wrongful ways. The implication of that is what you own, nobody else has a right over it by default. Right? What you own is yours and nobody else has a right over it. Right? As the Prophet ﷺ tells us, and there's understood from many verses of the Quran, كل المسلم على المسلم حرام. Everything of one Muslim is invaluable for another. Right? And here Muslim is an incidental condition. It refers to everything of one person is invaluable for another. دمه وماله وعرضه. Their life, their property, and their honor. So the inviolability of people's property is very important. So firstly, they own it, and they own it. Others do not have a right over it. You cannot take it, you cannot benefit from it, you cannot demand it. Right? And doing any of those, taking it, using it, demanding it, without permission, is batil, is wrong, unaccepted, false, sinful. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, إِلَّا except أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِّنْكُمْ, except that it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement. إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ, so except, meaning that if you seek something that is another's, إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً, except that it be trade عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِّنْكُمْ, on the basis of mutual agreement. Now here, of course, except that it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement, because normally someone won't give you something unless you give them something in return. The person's needy, right? So let's say you end up having 24 socks. Someone says, can I have 10 socks? You have needs, you have interest. Okay, you want 10 socks of mine? What will you give me? Right? That's the basis. The reality that the basis is that people are needy, and this the way Allah has created us. That people are trying to take care of their interests in this life. That they would have shuh, they would hold on to what they have, unless it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement. Now, trade covers where literally trade would be through buying and selling, where the ownership of that matter is handed over. Right? But trade also refers to when someone allows you to use what they have for a price. And that's rental agreements. You have sales, right? If you want something from another, you can either engage in a sales transaction, this is bay'ah, or you can say, you can't buy the house, but you want to be able to use it. And so you pay for usage. That is hire. And hire includes rent and lease and so on. And also, if someone works for you, you're not buying the person, you're just buying certain usage of their abilities. Acquiring usage. So, trade there, right, broadly of two types. Trade where ownership is transferred and where there is usage. But the verse also implies that it be through transaction on the basis of mutual agreement, tijara, right? And there, the basis is trade. Basis is that there be some item of exchange, but it is possible that there could be a transfer of ownership without any return, and that's what's called a gift. Right? A gift. Right? So you could have, on one side you could have transaction, which is either where ownership is transferred or ownership remains, but they give you a right to benefit, rent, lease, etc. Or it could be an exchange without compensation, and that could be either a gift, hiba, or lending, i'ara. Someone says, I really like those noise cancelling headphones. Say, sorry, I'm not giving them to you. Say, can I borrow them? Okay. So how can one person have what belongs to another? Okay. They can have it either by a monetary exchange or a non-monetary exchange. A monetary exchange would be either through sales or rental, hire, etc. And where you don't own the thing, but you pay for the right of using it. Or it could be a non-material exchange, which would be either gifting, where the ownership is transferred, or lending, where they let you use it, but they want it back. Okay. And there's a few other things that fall in here, which is inheritance, for example. A bequest or a will, and this is like a gift. Right? It's like a gift. Oh, let's not. But those are exceptional cases, right? So this is important to appreciate that what's a gift? A gift is a contract. A gift is a contract. It's an informal contract, but in all of this, what happens if there isn't clarity? Let's say the sister here is going to give a presentation. So she comes and says, Shaykh Faraz, your presenter, please. So I said, go ahead. But then what happens? She said, Jazakallah khair, that was a wonderful gift. What am I going to say? I just lent it to you. Right? And if we weren't civilized, we'd start fighting. Okay? Because naturally, now she has a presenter, she'd say, it's mine. I'd say, you borrowed it. And we'll fight. Okay? Which is not good. Which shows why, except that it be through transaction, right? Whether material or non-material, whether with transfer of ownership or the right of use, عن تراض منكم, on the basis of mutual agreement. Both parties agreed to what is taking place. And this is very, very important. Okay, this is very, very important to have mutual agreement. Why? Because the human interest, both worldly and spiritual, is only fulfilled through people coming together. Everything that causes relations to break down is undesirable in the Shara. Materially, people are needy of each other. Mutual agreement, when people deal with each other, preserves relationships and establishes trust. Everything that removes mutual agreement in transactions causes differences, dispute, and distances people from one another, hurts trust, and hurts individuals and society. And then it results in degrees of wrongdoing. Okay? Results in degrees of wrongdoing. So this is the sort of what they call mabda al-taradi, the principle of mutual agreement. We don't study the fiqh of transactions just because it's one of the chapters of fiqh, but rather because it relates to our day-to-day. Much of what we do every day is contracts. The fact that you have a phone line or a cell phone plan is a contract. The fact that you have leased a car is a contract. Getting a haircut is a contract. You're buying things is a contract. You're borrowing a book is a contract. You're shopping online is a contract. Now you can say, well, all of this takes place. That's true. But there are elements of what takes place around us broadly that are not. Some are not sound, but some are not proper, because they entail harm to human interests. And there are limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed that need to be observed for the preservation of human interests. The basis of transactions is permissibility. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, أحل الله البيع. But this is a general permissibility, not an absolute permissibility. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala follows up his affirmation of general permissibility, أحل الله البيع, by conditioning it. وحرم الربا, and he has prohibited riba. Now, explicitly there's a prohibition of riba, but by indication is that it's understood that the general permissibility of transaction is conditioned by except those things that Allah has prohibited. Okay? Except those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited. There has come great encouragement in both the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ with respect to trade and transaction. Throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls us to seek from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's provision. Okay? And to seek of the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? To seek of the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us in many hadiths that the طلب الحلال فريضة بعد الفرائض, seeking a lawful source of provision is a duty after the prescribed duties. And the Prophet ﷺ said, the best earnings of a person is from the work of their own hands. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ encouraged that التاجر الصدوق الأمين يحشر مع النبيين والشهداء والصديقين, that the trader who is genuinely true and trustworthy will be resurrected with the prophets and the veracious and the martyrs. And there's many hadiths that have come on the merits of the righteous trader. and also of righteous earning. نعم المال الصالح في يد الرجل الصالح. What a great thing is virtuous wealth in the hands of a virtuous person. Why? Because they will use it in good ways. And this is covered by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that المؤمن القوي خير أحب إلى الله من المؤمن الضعيف وفي كل خير. The strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, though there's good in both. That من أسباب القوة المال. There's many aspects of strength. There's spiritual strength and strength in doing good deeds and strength in serving others and strength in just righteousness, right? Strength in state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's some people whose dua is of greater benefit than the service of all those who serve. But from the means of strength is wealth that is sought sincerely and spent sincerely. So let's just to have a background on this. One of the reasons the ulama would teach the fiqh of transactions, why do we study it? Firstly, there's an individual level and a collective level. At the individual level, one is so that we can remain within the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our own transactions. We'll be looking at sales transactions, buying and selling, but we'll also see the principles related to rent and hire, and which covers employment contracts, rental contracts, leases, etc. And then many other aspects, and we'll be looking at things that affect permissibility, including riba and other prohibiting concepts like gharar, etc., that are not permitted. And although our purpose here is to study the text itself, but we'll be touching upon here and there some of the contemporary issues that arise. So these are of significance. We're not living in the 4th and 5th century when Imam Quduri wrote this book. But what he's saying, because this is derived from revelation, has derivative implications in our daily lives. So that we can stay within the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Protect our own self-interest, but also not harm others and not transgress the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he was the Khalifa, he forbade people from even entering the marketplace of Medina unless they had learned the fiqh related to the halal and the haram, to transactions. And it's related in the Muwatta of Imam Malik and elsewhere that he said, لا يدخل سوقنا من لم يتفقه في ديننا فإنه يقع في الربا شاء أم أبى. No one may enter our market unless they have gained understanding of our religion, meaning of the teachings of our religion related to the marketplace, which is fiqh al-mu'amalat. Otherwise, they will fall into the riba, into usury, into what Allah has prohibited, whether they want to or not. And the importance of knowing the limits related to anything that one does is highlighted by the hadith of An-Nu'man ibn Bashir, which is in the 40 Nawawi, that he said, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول, and it's significant because Nu'man ibn Bashir at that time was at most 5, maybe 6. He was the first born of the Ansar when the Prophet entered Medina. And he said, سمعت, I heard. So of course has many lessons that the Sahaba would take seriously their children learning, and they would learn with the adults as well from when they were very small. Many of the hadiths in the 40 Nawawi are related by children. So this dumb it down culture, let them just watch cartoons and play games and play basketball, and they'll be Muslims. And that's not the way of the Prophet ﷺ. Children would play, but there's a weightiness to the deen as well. Anyways, he said, then he heard the Messenger of Allah ﷺ say, what did he hear the Messenger of Allah ﷺ say?
إن الحلال بين وإن الحرام بين.
There's two narrations. إن الحلال بين or الحلال بين والحرام بين. The lawful is clear and the unlawful is clear. وبينهما أمور مشتبهات, and between the two are unclear matters. لا يعلمهن كثير من الناس, that most people don't know about. What is the مشتبه? المشتبه في حقك ما لم تعرف حكمه عينا. The unclear with respect to you is that which you do not, ما لم تعرف حكم الله فيه, is that which you do not know the ruling of Allah regarding. Even if the ruling is clear, but you don't know it, then everyone talks about this. Yeah, but you know what they say about it? No? Then it's mushtabih for you. It could be ma'lum min ad-din bi-darura. It's necessarily known to be of the religion. But for you, if you don't know what the ruling is, then you forgot. Someone, they were living, they grew up in a cave. They come out and they always get confused between wine and vinegar. One is halal and one is haram. Says, I'm used to eating greens, so before they used to just get it forage in the forest, but now, they go to the supermarket and there's this thing you put on the salad. They keep forgetting, is it wine or vinegar? Now what's the ruling of wine? It's necessarily known to be of the religion that is haram. But this person doesn't know, they get confused. So they say, maybe it's this one. Right? Can they just consume it? I say, tawakkal ala Allah? No. فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ. Whoever has taqwa of the shubuhat, whoever holds themselves back from the unclear, has safeguarded their religion and their honor. That's important. That you cannot wing it with respect to the limits of Allah. It should be fine. What if it's not? وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ وَقَعَ فِي الْحَرَامِ. What's the narration in the 40 Nawawi? وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ or يَقَعُ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ?
وقع.
It's coming more than one way. وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ وَقَعَ فِي الْحَرَامِ. Whoever falls into the unclear has fallen into the haram. It's inevitable. And the rest of the hadith explains the implications and that this affects you spiritually. Because truly in the body is a morsel of flesh which if sound, the entire body is sound, and if corrupted, the entire body is corrupted. Truly it is the heart. Telling us that how you observe the limits of Allah outwardly affects the state of your heart inwardly, but also the opposite. That if the state of the heart is corrupted, it will manifest in corrupt outward transactions. There's a reflexive relationship between the two. But how you conduct yourself with respect to the limits of Allah affects your spiritual state. You can't be spiritual but be doing all kinds of haram things. It just doesn't happen. That's why many scholars said that if you want your daily spiritual routines, your awrad to benefit, then be mindful of Allah عند البيع والشراء, when you're buying and selling. Why? Because Allah SWT tells us so. Right? The verses of light tell us. رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Those whose trade and transaction does not busy away from the remembrance of Allah and establishing the prayer and giving charity and so on. But dhikrillah there is, one is engaging in the dhikr of the tongue. Right? But also whose trade and transaction is not busy from remembering Allah, right, is to remember Allah Himself and His attributes, but also to remember the command of Allah by upholding it. Because you can't remember Allah but neglect His command. So, oh Lord, I love you. But your Lord saying, don't do that. Say, oh Lord, I love you. You say, La ilaha illallah. But that Allah is saying, don't do that, but you're like, La ilaha illallah. You're doing the haram. Doesn't work. Right? This is why Imam Suyuti says, من رضي أن يعمل بالجهل فقد رضي أن يعصي الله تعالى. Whoever is content to act ignorantly is content to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this aspect of transactions is very, very significant. Right? It's very, very significant. And it's a test of taqwa. Right? The test of taqwa. Especially because the acts of worship are easy, relatively speaking, in that if someone only a fool would not do it. Because you have to pay for your prayer? No. Right? Like, it makes sense. Even charity makes sense. You have a little bit of faith, you realize you give a little bit now, you get a lot later. It makes sense. Everybody else does it too. Like if you're in a community. So dhikr is easy, Quran is easy, comparatively speaking. But then you want to buy the house, but you can't do it because of circumstances. You're running a business, and can you just cut some corners? Can you do this? Can you do that? That's when the deen of a person is tested. And that's when the deen of a person is tested. That's why I say, no, Umar said, said, I'm paraphrasing, not to claim that you know somebody unless you have traveled with them, or traded with them, or differed with them. Right? Right? That these are tests of how a person is. Okay? Imam al-Ghazali, so what do we do then? Right? It is important to know these rulings. It's important to know these rulings. It's important to be aware of the ethics underlying them. Imam al-Ghazali describes that the rulings related to earning a living and transactions to be at two levels. And these are two general levels related to the fulfillment of rights in the Sharia. The baseline, and that's what the fuqaha describe, is al-adl. Because Allah is being just. Right? Is being just. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. Allah commands to justice and excellence. So al-adl is إعطاء الحق. Right? دون تقصير. Right? Adl, justice, is giving what is due without falling short, ولا تعدل, and not being excessive. But that's not it. Adl is not just that. وعدم مطالبة غير الحق, and not to demand other than what is rightfully yours. That is adl. And ihsan is to go beyond justice in giving others and to demand less than what is due in demanding from others. Okay? And we'll see aspects of ihsan as we go through. بإذن الله تعالى. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان. Okay? So there are two levels with respect to transactions. One is adl, which is fulfilling rights, and then the second level is ihsan, is excellence. Imam Ghazali also describes that there are qualities related to how you can make, and he describes it beautifully, your transaction in the marketplace of this world, right? In your trade, in your work, in your transaction, in your buying and selling, in your online shopping, from your transaction in the marketplace of the hereafter. And he gives some keys related to that. The book in the Ihya related to this, which is called Kitabu Adab al-Kasbi wal-Ma'isha, the book on the proper manners of earning a living, is translated into English quite very capably by Dr. Adi Setia, A-D-I, first name, last name is Setia, S-E-T-I-A, published in Malaysia. If those books used to have it, if they don't, we should make a group request that we should read what's going on. But that's a useful accompanying reading. But we'll be pointing to aspects from that, especially on the side of ethics. There's also, we'll be quoting many of the hadiths on the virtues of, related to the ethics of virtuous trading. So that's very important. Right? Because as some of the fuqaha say, in our times we don't just need fiqh, we need guidance. And we need fiqh clothed in the ethics and virtues so that people know not just what are their rights, but also they know how they can fulfill their rights in a good manner. In a manner that fulfills for them the good of this life and the next. Because we are often disconnected from the norms of good living, of virtuous living. Right? Okay, Bismillah. So that's meant to be a muqaddimah, an introduction to the subject. Last thing that can be said to close the muqaddimah, there's of course a call, part of the strength of the believer, individually and collectively related to the fiqh of transactions, is there is the virtues of our deen in their fullest are often difficult to fulfill when you are simply a cog in the system. It is possible to live a virtuous life as being part of just an employee in some company, working for someone else, etc. But the sad reality of the marketplace throughout history has been that people lie, cheat, and deceive in the marketplace. And by the marketplace we mean all types of transactions. We don't just mean like the mall or the shopping center or whatever, right? Just in people's economic activity. That there's generally lying, cheating, deception, oppression, disregard for human interest, disregard for the greater good, Someone says it's saying that it's the law of the jungle is dhulm to the animals in the jungle. Because the animals, uphold basic principles of dignity. Much of corporate culture does not. So throughout Islamic history, the righteous took cues from the prophetic community and they traded. Right? People like saying Islam spread through traders. Islam didn't spread through traders because they're like, hey, let's go for a vacation. Let's go to Indonesia. Let's go to Malaysia. Let's go to West Africa. Let's go down the African coast. Right? But part of it was that there are clear benefits in economic self-sufficiency that are understood from many hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, and we'll be sharing some as we go along the course. The Prophet ﷺ himself traded. Many of the leading companions traded. The Meccans were traders. Allah Ta'ala mentions a distinguishing blessing of Allah upon them. لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشِ إِيلَافِهِمْ, in favoring them, رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ, by the journey of winter and the journey of summer. And these were trade journeys. And those are tremendous blessings. But so the righteous try to uphold not just the basic limit just to get by, but they try to uphold not just adl, being just in their transaction, but when they try to uphold ihsan, excellence, when they try to uphold bir, virtue in their living, they realize it is difficult. It's often, not always, often difficult to do that just as being a cog in a deeply dunyawi system, in a very worldly system, a system that's not concerned about virtue, about excellence, not concerned about nusх, about care for the good of the other, etc. Broadly, we're not saying absolutely, there are exceptions everywhere. So they traded. Someone asked Imam Ahmad, what line of work should I pursue? And he gave an intriguing answer. He said, trade. Because there may be a funeral and there may be a sick person. And Imam Ahmad didn't like speaking too much, meaning that what's understood from that? That if you're working for, if you're working a 9-to-5 job, someone falls ill, can you take time out and go visit them? Usually it's difficult. Very often you don't have full control over your time. There may be a funeral. They're playing janazah. Can you attend both the funeral and the burial? Very often it's difficult. And of course, many other things related to that. Taking time out to go learn, taking time out to go and call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, of course, there's many ways to seek the good pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but trade was one of those things, and you see the impact of that in what the Muhajireen did, those who migrated from Mecca when they came to Medina. They came without anything. But Sayyidina Uthman funded a whole army. So many of the Sahaba who were traders were funding a whole body of companions who recently entered Islam, of those who came from, like those people who came from faraway tribes and came and spent time in Medina when the Ash'ariyin came, and they spent time, several weeks, learning, and then went back to their people. How were they being supported? Because the companions were trading, okay? And that is a component of Islamic history that is very significant. Right? That's very significant, and how it played out, right? In people who had the independence. They traveled to trade, but they traded with concern for their virtue, so people saw the virtues of their trading. One thing is to talk about virtue, the other is to uphold virtue in the messiness of human transactions. And that's what's really impressive. And that's how Islam entered so many alike. So that's just a little bit of background related to the fiqh of trade. Inshallah, we'll be pausing for Salat al-Asr here. We'll be back in 10 minutes, and we will open our look specifically at Kitab al-Buyur in the second part. Any questions before we break class?
Is there a difference between the word tijara and bay' lughatan?
Tijara is Bay'a. Well, bay'a sometimes can be used because bay'a is just mutlaq al-mubadala. But it's very useful for a talib ilm to appreciate the usage of the various core terms. So Ibn Abidin, for example, in the Hashiyah goes into that. Majma' al-Anhur pays a lot of attention to that, especially because the author of Majma' al-Anhur, Shaykh Zada, was also a great grammarian, and many others. But there are specific dictionaries of usage, and there's 4 that Hanafis should be aware of. If one only had one, then طلبة الطلبة with a طاء, طلبة الطلبة of a Nasafi, and this is not Hafizuddin Nasafi, it's an earlier Nasafi, is excellent. And there's an edition by Dar al-Nafa'is that is very useful. The editor is a little on the annoying side with his literalist introductions, but he's a good editor. He works hard. Most of the footnotes are really good as well, but he cross-references with other dictionaries. So Tilbat al-Talaba. Number 2, and this is a work quoted frequently in the books of fiqh, which is called Al-Mughrib by Al-Muttarizi, with a shadda on the top. Al-Muttarizi, who was a student of the students of Imam al-Zamakhshari, and is specifically a dictionary of the terms of the Hanafis. Third, there is a work called Anisul Fuqaha by Al-Qunawi. It's also quite useful. Number 4 is a work that the Indian ulama used to really love, called Dustur al-Ulama. Dustur with a ta. Dustur al-Ulama by Maulana Ahmad Nagari. Ahmad Nagari, or something like that. His name is like Abdul Nabi ibn Abdul Rasul or something. It's very interesting. Ahmad Nagari. That's very useful. But also the larger books. This one of the things to look at the larger books. They explain the usage of the word and the different ways it's used. Sometimes it seems pedantic, but those are mafatih, keys to understand what's being said later. Because there's difference between ba'a and ibta'a, etc. So those are very useful works.
So what edition did you mention for Tilbatul Talaba?
Darul Nafa'is.
Are there any supplementary readings besides the one that you recommend, Salih's book?
Throughout the class?
Yeah, for this section.
I have a few things I'll be sharing bi'idhnillah ta'ala. It is helpful. The Majallatul Ahkam al-Adliya is brilliant. So 2 works I'll be referring to. I'm not suggesting you necessarily get them or anything, at least not immediately right now or anything like that. Majallatul Ahkam al-Adliya is actually translated to English, and it's actually online in English, so it's actually quite useful. I'll be sharing key items from the Majalla. Some of the most important we have here in this, in what I've shared for lesson 1. Okay? Some of the basic terms. So the Majalla was the Ottoman commercial law code. A lot of stuff happened in Ottoman Turkey. There was a lot of pressure to basically secularize, to basically adopt the French legal code in Turkey. a lot of internal and external pressure. So a group of ulama led by Allama Ahmed Jawdat Basha, and a number of other significant ulama, amongst them Ala ad-Din Abidin, the son of Ibn Abidin, amongst them Shaykh Amin Jundi, the author of Islah Ilm al-Hal, and a number of others, were part of a committee led by Ahmed Jawdat Basha to put together a commercial law code according to Hanafi school. And that became the law of the land. And they dealt with a lot of tricky issues that were arising. So there's khilaf on it and it became a subject of criticism. And great commentaries were written on the Majalla. We'll discuss that separately at some point. But the Majalla is useful. I'll be pointing to key things from the Majalla here and there. You can find the Arabic of the Majalla online, and you can find the English of the Majalla online if it helps you here and there. If you want to gain a background understanding of Islamic finance and some of the values underlying it, etc., it cannot but help to read Mufti Taqi Usmani's work, Islamic Finance and Introduction. And that's available online as well. But right now the goal is to understand the core concepts, but to really understand one does need to put in effort and read. One of the great contemporary specialists in fiqh al-mu'amalat or fiqh al-qadaya al-mu'asira, the fiqh of contemporary issues, particularly financial transactions, is a distinguished Shafi'i scholar, Shaykh Muhyiddin Qarradaghi. He put حقيبة طالب علم فقه المعاملات, a sort of a حقيبة, like a repository of what you need to know. It's about 20 volumes. Okay? There's a lot of work that's been done. Contemporary issues, one needs to know background. Imam Muhammad al-Hasan used to be very careful about his time. So much so that he was a no-nonsense kind of guy. Imam Shafi'i came to ask to borrow books, he told him to leave him alone. In the end, Imam Shafi'i had to write poetry to convince him to lend him his books. إِنَّ الْعِلْمَ لَيَمْنَعُ أَهْلَهُ أَنْ يَمْنَعُهُ أَهْلَهُ. Knowledge prevents its people from preventing it from its people. The great student of Imam Malik came, Asad al-Furat, to study with Muhammad al-Hasan, said, I don't have any time. He had no time from Fajr till Isha and after. So what do you do before Fajr? He said, I worship my Lord. So what do you do when you get up for wudu? Before you begin your worship of your Lord. And that time wasn't taken. So the only time he gave Asad al-Furat was the time when he was making wudu to prepare for prayer. Yet Muhammad al-Hasan periodically would take time out and go to the marketplace and talk to the traders and spend time with them. People were surprised. Because this man valued his time. So much so that Muhammad al-Hasan's relations had broken down for many years with his own teacher, Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf. Because Qadi Abu Yusuf, when he became the Chief Justice, he wanted righteous justices, Qudat, working under him, so he wanted Muhammad al-Hasan to be the first of them. Muhammad al-Hasan refused for a long time. Then Qadi Abu Yusuf exercised his seniority and his being the Chief Justice to force him to be the Qadi over Ray, I believe. And he was forced to listen, but he felt that being cut off from his teaching was a grave harm that was inflicted upon him. For many years he was estranged with his own teacher. And then things proved. But despite all of that, he spent time in the marketplace. And he was asked why. He said, because how can we rule over what they do if we don't know their circumstances? Right? And that's something that's very, very significant. Imam Al-Haskafi says, من لم يكن عالما بزمانه فهو جاهل. Whoever does not know their times is ignorant. And some added the Quran, وَإِن كَثُرَ عِلْمُهُ, even if they know a lot. Meaning they're ignorant of those matters that they don't have an understanding of. So it's very important. But it takes time. But it takes deliberateness. Right? There's only so much one can study on one's own. But there's readings and so on. One has to invest time in it. And this is one of the great areas. The effort of the ulama for the last 60 years, much of it, of the fuqaha, of the scholars of fiqh, has gone into two areas. Financial transactions and medical ethics. These are two of the great areas where a lot of effort has gone. There's many other contemporary issues, but much of the effort of the great fiqh academies and the senior ulama involved in contemporary issues goes in these two areas. We'll be recommending different things, but it's upon the seeker to seek, basically. So, inshallah, 10-minute break. So right now it's 6:18. We'll be back at 6:28 for just a brief opening of Kitab al-Buyu.
I guess you realize it because I saw you click through. We didn't start.
Yeah, I was confused for a good 10 minutes and then I realized.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر، الله أكبر، الله أكبر، الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة. قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر.
الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
Technically, I have another copy of this, but it's that copy of the red book there. So it's got a big text in the middle, which is a different commentary on this book, which is the Zayn Hazm. And then just on the margins is this book.
And which book is this?
Oh, should we go? Sure.
No, no, I mean,
This is just
So this is this here's Lubab. This is the commentary that we're reading from.
so
Stuff in the
what is Lubab?
Right. We are reading Mukhtasar al-Quduri, which that is a
So
term.
Lubab is the main show.
Yeah, so the shah that
That's
we're
fine.
yes, the best shah,
That's what-
clearest shah of al-Quduri
This
is
is the Lubab by.
Shaykh Abdul Ghani and Maidan.
Oh yeah. No,
Oh.
no, Maidani is the author of the Quduri.
No.
No, is that right? Quduri is the author. You're right.
Is this the same Maidani that
Shaykh
has
Abdul
the
Ghani?
famous Aqidah commentary?
What's his name?
Which one?
Is it the
Can't read
Hawiyah
that
commentary?
straight.
No, that's
Al-Mani al-Madani.
There is the Hawi.
No,
Al-Maidani.
who has the Sharh on Imam Tahawi's Aqidah?
I don't know which one.
Maidan. Okay. I was wondering if it's the same Maidan.
I'm not sure if it is.
So here you have Quduri in the brackets, right? The method of Quduri in the brackets, and the commentary afterwards. Here we have and that edition, right? You have Quduri here
Okay,
completely,
yeah, got it.
and then you have Quduri in brackets,
Yeah.
followed by what the commentary has to say.
On that particular point.
So So Shaykh Faraz,
Okay.
I've already heard, by the way.
1 second.
Can I borrow your Rabbani?
Shaykh Faraz reads from here. So like as he's going through a place like marriage. Here. So
Don't you already have one?
it's useful,
Already
but
have
not
one.
now
Can you get a
because
second one?
it will, as you learn your Arabic,
Second.
right? It's useful to read from here.
How much
So
you buy it
read the
for?
commentary. It's like
Yeah,
you read
I
the
think
thing,
they're in the
$15.
context.
and then you just have to jump to where it is, right?
Because
So
like
this.
follow
have
the
it.
Yeah, so when you get to the end of one, just jump to the other. Every once in a while, right, he'll say something, like he'll make a point.
And then
Is
this
this
is where you have
blue?
all these things going on. Okay.
Yeah, so like once in a while,
index is
he'll
at
make
the
a
back.
point, but the point he's
Oh, you haven't
saying
opened up blue or
is literally a translation of what's in the commentary. So that's why.
where does it say? Does it say Fossil when you start a new part or a new chapter or whatever?
Like you'd say this, and he'd say. oh,
If it's in Quduri, then it will. Otherwise, no.
So it doesn't say like Kitab blue.
No, it won't. Yeah.
Will it say in a different heading sort of thing?
Other stuff he
You might
doesn't
have it in fancy brackets.
that he brings from his own
No,
books, so those
okay.
are the margins, right? Like all the other things, but underline, because I'm not reading the full commentary. There's
Yeah.
a lot of it sometimes gets into, I guess, unimportant details.
Or
for that, right? So I underline the parts of the commentary that he brings up.
That was Hajjah?
Oh,
So when I
that's what
review,
you're
The Book of Stoning?
so when I review
Kitab
all of the
al-Hajjah? The Book of
missing
Stoning?
parts I'm reading,
Yeah.
I only the important parts.
So did we ever do Ta'lim al-Muta'allim
So I
in
read,
full?
like if you,
I think
if
so.
I were to read this
Yeah.
chapter.
I can't find I found one recording.
So if I were to
Or
read.
two recordings.
Quite a
Before we
few.
start another
Huh?
class,
Like two
so-
two recordings of the whole
Is
until
that-
we started.
No, they're 20 minutes each.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So we're beginning كتاب البيوع from Mukhtasar Quduri after looking at some opening introductory discussions. Imam Quduri says, Rahimahullah, Kitab al-Buyu'a. He puts it in the plural because the types of transactions are many. Okay? The types of transactions are many. The types of sales transactions are many. Some call it Kitab al-Bay', the book of the sale, because you're describing the sales transaction as a category of transaction. In structuring the books of fiqh, broadly, there are two approaches that the Hanafi scholars had as to what came after the ibadat. So the 5 books on ibadat, purification, prayer, fasting, zakat, and then hajj, what comes after the chapters on worship, is broadly 2 approaches. Some gave precedence to nikah. Why? Because nikah is described as being like an act of worship. Right? It's a sunnah maqsuda. It's a sunnah that is sought. Right? And nikahu min sunnati. Right? And so insofar as that it has elements of being an act of worship and the act of providing and so on, it has a number of elements that would entail that you put it first. And also, it is through nikah that humanity is preserved. Okay. But the other criteria is, if there's no if you cannot trade, there's no society. If there's no society, you ain't getting married, right? So, right? So, in that sense, some books put Kitab al-Buyu' first. After, in the book of sales, they put that before, and the related chapters before the chapters on marriage. So you'll see different books are structured in different ways because of differing considerations. And this Lubab talks a little about it. So he, Mawlana Al-Imam Al-Quduri rahimahullah says, البيع ينعقد بالإيجاب والقبول إذا كانا بلفظ الماضي. The sales transaction البيع ينعقد comes into effect through a clear offer and a clear acceptance. If both are in the definite, okay? إذا كانا بلفظ الماضي, if they're in the past tense, because the past tense indicates the definite, then he'll give us some related details. So first, al-bay'a. The al here is categorical, للاستغراق. All sales, all bay'a, all sales come into being through ijab and qabul. So the al here is للاستغراق. In the Arabic language, bay'a is used for any transaction between two parties. Right? So it tells us, لغة مبادلة شيء بشيء. In the Arabic language, bay'a is used for any exchange, whether it is mal, whether it is wealth, or anything else. Right? And bay' and shira, right? Buying or selling, both are of what are called the adad, the opposites. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. Allah has purchased from the believers their selves and their wealth in exchange for paradise. Imam al-Nasafi, of course, Imam Hafiz al-Nasafi in his tafsir says, in this verse is proof that no verbal offer and acceptance is required for buying or selling. Now, so there's a useful discussion on bay'a in the commentary of the Lubab, but he gives us a definition, right? That وَشَرْعًا مُبَادَلَةُ مَالٍ بِمَالٍ بِالتَّرَاضِي. It's an exchange of mal for mal. Mal is an item of material value for another item of material value through, with mutual agreement, بالتراضي. And this is a definition of the al-bay' al-sahih, the sound sale. Because if someone is forced to sell, there isn't taradi, the sale is valid but suspended. Right? It is suspended pending the approval of the person who transacted. Right? So al-bay'a is mubadalatu malin bimal. And this is a sufficient definition, right? The one given by the commentator here. An issue arises, of course, what is mal? What is an item of value? Right? What is an item of value? And this is significant, and its significance is manifest in our times. would we consider non-material property to be property? So for example, an e-book, right? And of course, modern things, there's other problems that happen. Is it ownership or not anyways? Because recently one service shut down, so it's like to wipe out all, because they're very complex licensing agreements. So when you quote unquote buy an e-book, do you actually own it, or do you own the right to it, right? And that's where a lot of contemporary fiqh would arise. But also ethical issues arise in those things, that if you were setting up a service, would you offer it in that way? Is it in what aligns best with our values? Right? So there's many issues there. Our copyrights of consideration, that has to do with this as well. Right? So the مبادلة مال بمال, right? So mal, Ibn Abdin gives a definition of mal, right? And this is quoted by others as well, right? And he similarly quoted in Bahr al-Ra'i and others, that المراد بالمال ما يميل إليه الطبع ويمكن ادخاره لوقت الحاجة. You know, mal, an item of value, is something that people incline towards and seek to store, and seek to keep till when they need it. Right? So المالية تثبت بتمول الناس. Something being of value is established by people valuing it. Whether some or all, people ascribe value to it. Now, so in the Shara you have the concept of mal, right? Of mal, which is an item of value. And then you have two types of items of value. ما أبيح الانتفاع منه شرعا فهو متقوم. That which is permitted to benefit from for a Muslim, this is called المال المتقوم. And that which is not permitted to benefit from is غير المتقوم. So, for example, if we take this definition, المال, right? المال, an item of value, is what people consider to be of value. Whether some or all, right? Whether some or all. So is wine an item of value? Yes or no?
In our time it is.
It's always been an item of value. In what time wasn't it an item of value?
Well, if you're living in the Muslim world back then, they would.
But there's non-Muslims and there's corrupt people. As long as there were grapes, people wanted wine. Right? So it's mal, right? It's an item of value, but it is not mutaqawwim. It is so al-mal al-mutaqawwim, an item of value, of recognized value, is ما أبيح الانتفاع منه شرعا, is that which is permitted to benefit from for the believer. And that's important because we consider the transactions of non-Muslims amongst each other permissible, even if they buy and sell things that we consider to be haram, because it's mal. Right? Whether it's right or wrong, it's mal. We cannot transact with them in the things that we do not consider to be mal, mutaqawwi. Right? So it's exchanging of an item of value with an item of value with mutual agreement. And this definition is good. Now, there is an apparent difference of opinion amongst the later scholars that the item of value doesn't have to be tangible. Doesn't have to be a ayn. Right? Some of the definitions would indicate yes, others would indicate no. But many of the relatively earlier books as well, like Al-Hawi al-Qudsi, for example, right? Is mal an item of value, is something other than a human being that was created to fulfill the interests of a human being. That is possible to gather, وَأَمْكَنَ إِحْرَازُهُ وَالتَّصَرُّفُ فِيهِ, and to transact in on the basis of choice. An item of value is something you can acquire, that people would desire, acquire, keep, use. Right? Now, it's something, right? Anything that people would wish to acquire. Why is this important? Because a whole host of things that we'll see later amongst them, like are copyrights recognized, for example, right? Intangible ownership, things like e-books, this, that. Does it have to be something tangible? And though some of the definitions, including, for example, Imam al-Haskafi, Dur al-Mukhtar, mentions in his discussion that it's عَيْنٌ يَجْرِي فِيهَا التَّنَافُسِ. It's a tangible matter that people would vie for, right? That people would seek the value. Is this definition that it has to be a ayn, something tangible, a necessary clause or an incidental clause? And there's discussion on that. The summary of what the leading contemporary ulama mentioned, and the definition that Ibn Abdin is pointing towards, that we mentioned what is mal, is that no, it's not. So therefore, most of the leading contemporary ulama, including the great Hanafis of our times like Mufti Taqi Usmani, hafidhahullah, would affirm that intangible items, intangible things can be considered items of recognized value, can be considered mal mutaqawwim, if the conditions of ownership are fulfilled in them. Okay? So that's important. Mufti Taqi Usmani discusses that in his work, Fiqh al-Buyur. The third item, so we need to understand what is a sale, mubadalatu malin bimal. We need to understand, secondly, what is mal. Okay? So you have mal, mutaqawwim, and ghayr mutaqawwim. An item of value, recognized value. The third concept to be clear about, that for a sale to be binding, there has to be taradi. There has to be established mutual agreement. And we refer to the Quranic verse, Surah An-Nisa, verse 29. And this is very important. And it has a metaphysical component too, because the very nature of the human being is that existent living entity that has choice, that has been honored by the divine. لقد كرمنا بني آدم. The أصل الكرامة الإنسانية, right? وجود العقل والاختيار. They have an intellect by which they can make choices. Right? And Abu Hanifa said, وَسَلْبُ الْإِخْتِيَارِ إِهْدَارٌ لِآدَمِيَتِهِ, is negating their choice, is negating their very humanness, negating their rightful choice. So taradi is a very key component. That's why we'll see there's certain ma'ani mufsida lil-aqd. There are certain things that corrupt a transaction. Right? And they say, كل ما يزيل وصف التراضي فهو مفسد للعقد. Everything that would vitiate the quality of mutual agreement would corrupt the transaction. And we'll be looking at what corrupts a transaction when we come to it. The foundation of a sales transaction is a valid offer and acceptance. Right? البيع ينعقد بالإيجاب والقبول. The sales transaction comes into effect through an offer and an acceptance. In the Hanafi school, the integrals of the sales transaction are a valid offer and acceptance. So they say, Imam al-Mawsili in al-Ikhtiyar says something to the effect that وَرُكْنُهُ صُدُورُ that what is the sales transaction takes place بِصُدُورِ رُكْنِهِ مِنْ أَهْلِهِ عَلَى مَحَلِّهِ. Right? The sales transaction takes place when its integral is found from those fit to transact on the subject matter of the transaction. So the integral is an offer and acceptance. And we'll look at what an offer and acceptance is. They both have to be decisive, right? The ahl, those fit to transact, are those who have two qualities, which are al-aql wa al-tamyiz, right? That they're sane and have reached the age of discernment, which in court would be 7 years, but in practice, for small things, could be someone younger than that. So if you see, the Hamza started a candy shop, but he also sells in it fancy Yemeni shawls and $300 oud. Right? So he has 30 cents, $30, and $300. These are three things that he has for sale. So now if a 4-year-old kid comes and wants to buy candy, could you sell it to him or her? Yeah, because you could expect, well, not here, like 5-year-old child comes, wants to buy something. In the Muslim world, people would say, yeah, sure. Right? Because normally, you expect parents would approve that they would buy organic, halal, tayyib sweets from you. Yeah, sure. But they want to buy a $30 shawl. Would a 5-year-old child typically have permission to do that? Probably not. That's sin tamyiz, right? The age of discernment. Suzul ruknihi is the ijab and qabul. We'll be looking at that. Min ahli, from those fit to transact. Ala mahallihi, on the mahal, the subject matter, literally the place, but meaning the subject matter of the transaction. What is the subject matter of the transaction? So I sell you this silha for $100. What is the subject matter of this transaction? Yeah, so this is an important point to keep in mind. The subject matter of the transaction is not the $100. Because you have the item of sale, the mabi', and you have the thaman. المقصود من البيع هو المبيع. Right? What is sought from the sale is the item of sale. وإنما الثمن وسيلة إلى البيع إلى المبيع. The price is simply a means to the item of sale. Which is why if you do not mention what is being sold, the sale is invalid. I'll sell you something for $100. Invalid. Let's make a transaction here. Of course, this is Bay' al-Fuduli. See, I'm going to cancel it as soon as I do it. Shaykh Yusuf. I sell you this sibha. Say you accept.
I think so.
Okay. Now, it's Umamar's, I have to take it back. Okay. But that sale, had it been a real sale, would be valid but fasid, corrupt. Because one of their conditions for soundness of the sale was missing, which is mentioning the price. But the core, what invalidates a sale is if there was no offer or acceptance, either party was unfit to transact, or the subject matter of the sale, meaning the item of sale, does not fulfill the conditions of a valid item of sale. And we'll be touching upon those because these are foundational concepts, right? And there are a number of conditions for the valid sale. We'll be looking at them when we begin, because we wanted to give us, because if we don't understand these foundational concepts, the rest of the chapter is a bit on the fuzzy side of unclear. So now we call the sales transaction aqdul bay', right? Aqd. In the Arabic language, aqada is to tie something together. It's irtibat. It's to tie one thing to another. Right? So aqdul bay', right? Because there is an irtibat. There is a tie. Two people tie one, latch on. There's an offer that's tied to, or there's an acceptance that is tied to an offer. Right? So that's the irtibat. They also say it's called aqd because in the Arabic language, aqd, people would shake hands when they would buy and sell. And that was there's a physical irtibat coming together, but that's secondary. Now, in aqada, right, yan'aqidu is yahsulu shar'an, right? So define it. البيع وينعقد أي يحصل شرعا, right? ينعقد إن عقد, in فعل pattern, the يحصل شرعا, it comes to be, right? بالإيجاب, right? So you have an offer and an acceptance. In the Hanafi school, the offer could be from either party and the acceptance could be from either party. So al-ijab, right, the offer. And in the Arabic language, ijab, awjaba, right, to make something wajib, right, it's ijab is al-ithbat, it's a firm offer, right? It's not just any offer. Hey, how about you buy my 6th pair of shoes? So I accept. No, that wasn't an offer. That was a suggestion. So ijab it's a firm offer. It's an offer of sale, right? It's a firm offer of sale, right? So, because the root meaning of it is ithbat, is firm affirmation. That's why he says الإيجاب هو ما يذكر أولا من كلام أحد المتعاقدين or من كلام أحد العاقدين. The definition of the lughat is really good. The ijab is what is mentioned first from the speech of the two transacting parties لإنشاء التصرف, right? In order to initiate the transaction, right? In order to initiate the transaction, right? Which is why item 101 of the Majalla gives a good definition of ijab, and 102 gives a good definition of qabul, right? It's not the first speech, so it's not the ahlan wa sahlan was the first thing one would say. The other person says shlonak. That's not ijab and qabul, right? What they mean is, so this is a descriptive definition, right? ما يذكر أولا من كلام أحد العاقلين على وجه الإثبات لإنشاء التصرف, right? In a firm manner to initiate the transaction, right? And the qabul, the acceptance, is that which is mentioned second from the two transacting parties, right? The Majalla summarizes the legal discussion on this, that the qabul is يعني ثاني كلام يصدر من أحد العاقدين لأجل إنشاء التصرف به التصرف وبه يتم العقد. It's the second statement said to initiate the transaction by which the transaction is completed. If إذا كانا بلفظ الماضي, if they are in the past tense, right? If they're in the past tense, right? Meaning if they're decisive. So it could be also the present tense if it indicates decisiveness. And we will see that it is also valid but non-verbally, right? So the ijab and qabul can be spoken, can be in writing, and it can also be non-verbal. How? Let's say, I've draped the sibha on the counter. I'm talking to my wife and we're just discussing what's for dinner and so on. And Zayn, poor guy, is trying to buy the sibha. There's no price listed. So he's looking at it. So he takes out $100, gives it to me. I take the $100, he takes the sibha. Where's the offer and where's the acceptance? There isn't one. This is called ta'aqi. Just non-verbal exchange. If the item of sale is clear and the payment is clear, this is also valid. This is called ta'aqi. And at the bottom of where it says إذا كان بلفظ الماضي, right? It says an important principle in the commentary, وَالْمَعْنَى هُوَ الْمُعْتَبَرْ فِي هَذِهِ الْعُقُودِ. It is the meaning that counts in transactions. وَلِهَذَا يَنْعَقِدُ بِالتَّعَاقِي, right? And that's why it is also valid by non-verbal exchange, right? You give the money, they give you the item. And the relied upon position is the ta'ati, non-verbal exchange, is valid في النفيس والخسيس, في الخسيس والنفيس, in small things but also in valuable things. So let's say, I don't have a house. Let's say, Hamza Chaudhary, wealthy landholder, is sitting in front of a property. It has a big for sale sign, but he's bored stiff. Nobody's coming to buy the house. So he is on the phone with one of his teachers in in a small city in Hadramaut. So this really polite sister, she's there. Polite sister is really wealthy. She wants to buy the house for $1 million. She came with a suitcase that has $1 million. Trying to catch his attention. No. She opens the screen. He's like, yeah. But he's on the phone. He points to the phone. She points to the house. And he points to the money. And it says $1 million. Hamza goes like this. Sister gives him the thing. He gives her the keys. Would that be valid? Yes. Right? في النفيس في الخسيس والنفيس. In cheap things and valuable things. And that's the relied upon position. Because the basis is, there's an exchange. On the basis of mutual agreement. However, right? And this is, and that's why he says, in nafis, in valuable things, and in cheap things. And that's a sound opinion. And the author quotes the Hidayah لِتَحْقِيقِ الْمُرَاضَةِ, because both parties have accepted this. Now, this is a point of caution, that this is huwa sahih, this is the sound opinion, but there's a weak opinion within the madhab. The opinion of Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Karhi, rahimahullah, one of the great early imams, who said that at-ta'ati, non-verbal exchange, is يَصِحُّ فِي الْخَسِيس دُونَ النَّفِيس. It is valid for small things, not for big things. For big things, there has to be a clear offer, spoken or written. You cannot just do a monetary, just a non-verbal exchange for it. What is khasis and nafis? Some people said it marji'uhu ila al-urf. What is considered in the khasis, in paltry things and valuable things, some said that it goes back to urf. Others said that the cheap is that which is less than the nisab of sariqa, less than the extent that is punishable. Because someone steals one apple, they're not considered, that is not permitted, but you cannot be punished for theft for that. You have a lesser punishment. The hadd of sariqa would not apply. So some said that. Anyway, so practically, if you're buying something valuable, you should have a clear offer and acceptance, whether spoken or in writing, not just exchange things. Okay, so these are a few of the grounding principles related to the transactions, and what is the sale. We will continue from here next week with Allah Ta'ala by looking at the reality that negotiations aren't binding. Right? It's called khiyarul majlis. And there's a difference of opinion between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is related to the meaning of a hadith. So we'll begin with that. And we'll also look at the issue of needing to define what is the price and what currency you are referring to. And we'll look at that it's valid also to defer a sale, but on condition that it be to a known deferral. And then that you can sell, if you sell something, it has to be specified by volume, weight, or quantity, or some other way that specifies it. But something that is in front of you, if you just sell a heap of something, right? So let's say some sister made some amazing za'atar, and I'll sell you the za'atar. So how much is it? I don't know, but but this bottle belongs to my husband. It's actually, he uses it to make iced coffee, so I can't give it to you. Just empties it on the kitchen counter and says, I'll sell you this sa'ata for $10. You say, sure, and you put it in a Ziploc bag or whatever. That's valid. And so we'll look at some of the implications. What if you buy something and exclude particular units from it? So we look, and some of it gets technical, so do prepare, right? So we'll do our best to get as close to Babu Khiyar al-Shart as we can. So we'll be marching a little bit next class. بإذن الله. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
What was Imam ibn Abidin's